Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream. For nearly a year, every Monday, we are covering an important topic facing America, facing Texas, facing your state, considering that most of you tuning in here live outside the great state of Texas. And this week, I have two friends, two guests who, like me, also happen to be proud Texans, but this is a topic that is relevant to everyone in the United States. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, Executive Director of the Foundation and your host of this live stream. Today, we talk about a real important topic facing not just the conservative movement, not just the state of Texas, not just America, but really the entire world. And that is the emergence of a broad, multi-ethnic working class coalition oriented around the principles of limited government, free enterprise, increasing freedom, and very importantly, those institutions of civil society like our families and our churches that help us wake up each day and be optimistic that tomorrow will be even brighter than today. And so joining me today to flesh out this wonderful hour of ideas and policies and an optimistic future are my friends Monica de la Cruz Hernandez, joining us from Edinburgh, Texas, and Jorge Martinez, who is the Texas Coalition's Director for the Libre Initiative. He's in Mission, just around the corner from Edinburgh. I'm here in Austin, the greatest state capital of the greatest state, the greatest country in the history of the world. And so what we're going to talk about today is how, looking especially at the results of the 2020 election, people who are center-right, whether they call themselves conservatives, libertarians, centrists, heck, if they just call themselves Texans or Americans, ought to be optimistic about what's coming down the pike. And not just in terms of the 2022 election or the 2024 election, but far more importantly, how we go about our daily lives in between elections and campaigns. And so to you, Monica and Jorge, thanks so much for joining me. We're going to turn to you, Monica, first. You had a recent experience in the 2020 election cycle that allowed you to understand firsthand what we're getting at with the rationale behind this week's conversation. And that is that far more people than the left media would like to let on are really interested in the messages that are pro-family, pro-school choice, in favor of the Second Amendment, in favor of free enterprise and limited government. Tell us about that before we start getting into a little more policy detail.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on today. I greatly appreciate that. And we are seeing a movement happening here in the border. I'm in the very most southern tip of the border, Rio Grande Valley. And what we're seeing is a movement happening, an awakening. You know, most people in this area grew up much like I did as a Democrat. And we're the Kennedy Democrats, a little more conservative of a Democrat. But what we're seeing now is the Democrat Party has moved towards socialism, has become so liberal that the values, the conservative values of Hispanic on the border no longer align with that party. And there was an awakening in the 2020 election where we were able to educate other Hispanics in this area about how their values aligned with the Republican Party and really let them make the choice. And I think that's what was key here, was nobody was shoving down the Republican Party down anybody's throat. What we were doing was we were educating, and we were saying, these are the Republican values, these are the Hispanic values, these are the Democrat values, which aligns more closely to you. And what we saw is that Hispanics were choosing at an exciting rate that their values were closely aligned with the Republican Party.
Well, I tell you, what inspiration, not just from you, but from many other people, whether they were in the 2020 cycle running for office as you were. Of course, you're here on today's live stream with a 501c3 talking about ideas and talking about how we can implement them in daily life. But the point is that whether in seeking elective office, as you were doing, or people who are merely just trying to run their businesses or have conversations with people in the line at the sandwich shop, or thinking about the work you do, George, and making sure that we connect people's values with policy outcomes in the Texas legislature. We know that in spite of what the left of center media would like to tell us, which is that those of us who are conservatives ought to go put our noses in the corner and never come out to play, that there are a lot of reasons to be smiling. And so George Martinez with Libre Initiative, you live this every day. You've done this work for several years. And I'm curious, before we get into some specific conversations about policy areas, if you might give us a sense of what your experience tells you about the mood of people right now in the country.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, first of all, for having me. It's an honor to be with you and you as well, Monica. A little bit about what Libre is doing and the experience that I've seen on the ground as a grassroots organization. Well, one, the mission for Libre is to empower Hispanics to reach their full potential. And we do that in 4 ways. And one of the ways is engaging in meaningful ways with the Hispanic community. You got to build trust, right? And that takes time. As you said, we've known each other for a few years. I've been with the organization going on 9 now, and we founded in 2011 by our founder and president, who also lives here in Mission, in Hidalgo County on the border. And what we found on the ground while we're educating and informing the community is that a lot of people are starting to open up to the ideas, the principles, and the values of free markets, of capitalism. And running away from the idea of socialism, many people left countries that espouse those ideas. I, for one, am someone who was born in Mexico, raised in California, and fortunately found Texas. As soon as I could, I came. And what we found is that many people are coming to Texas, like myself, and we're seeing that we want opportunity. People want an opportunity to get a hand up, not a hand out.
Yeah, that's well said. And so, George, you just very briefly touched on your life story that brought you to the conservative movement, the center-right coalition. Monica, you have an equally compelling life story there as someone, as you mentioned, who grew up in a family that was left of center, at least in its party affiliation was left of center. It might have been pretty conservative. And yet here you are, one of the icons of the conservative woman year. You fell a little bit short in 2020. That's given you, through Providence, the opportunity to do things like this, talk about conservative ideas, talk about broadening the audience, an optimistic future. But the point is, for our audience members who themselves at this moment might be left of center, or who have themselves undergone a transition to understanding themselves as being conservatives, what is it about your life story that caused you to realize that you're really a conservative?
Yes, well, I can tell you this is I am an everyday person. I am like many Americans and many people who come over here looking for the American dream. I come from simple beginnings. I was raised by a single mom. There is no political background in my story. We're just hardworking Americans who saw an opportunity for an American dream. My husband, through working hard, we were able to successfully own 3 small businesses. And I really come from a family who has love of country. My grandfather served in the United States Navy in World War II. My brother served 20 years honorably in the U.S. Air Force. And so and I was brought up with a love of country, love of God, and love of the opportunities that are before us. And my grandfather wanted us to have equal opportunity, not equal results. And that is the way that I grew up, is that the opportunity is there for you to grab if you want to work hard. And if you give glory to God and work hard and work towards those American dreams, you can do it. And I'm living proof that we can come from simple beginnings and we can seize the American dream. And so I think that's why people were able to gravitate and to relate with me, because I'm just like them. I'm an everyday American.
Well, and I think that message, Monica, was repeated time and again, especially in border counties across Texas, where we saw just thinking about the presidential race, a huge swing from the share of Democrat and Republican votes in 2016 versus the share of Democrat and Republican votes in 2020. And there, I'm not even thinking about specific presidential candidates as much as leading a think tank. I'm thinking about those ideas that were appealing to people in those counties. I presume that you saw those in your race, and I'll come back to you on that point. But George, I want to pitch this question to you, because what you do and the work that Libre does is far upstream from campaigns and elections. In fact, I think y'all have been instrumental in getting past the mistake that campaigns do, which is show up to ask for votes just during campaign season. You've actually done this revolutionary thing for human beings, which is actually to form relationships with people so that when it comes to exerting political behavior, whether by calling to support legislation or support particular candidates, there's actually a friendship there. I'm curious, as a result of that, what lessons you've learned. I mean, what wisdom would you impart on our audience as we think about broadening the audience of people who want to support our message?
Yeah, I think 10, 20 years ago, we were talking about how the Hispanic vote was going to be very important, right? Well, we're in it today. We are living that today. And what we found is that if you are trying to make inroads in the Hispanic community, like I said earlier, you have to build trust. You can't just gain our trust from one night to the next, and you have to be here. You have to stay, and it takes time. So we're like every other person. We have families to take care of. We're trying to provide for them and get ahead in life and achieve our American dream, right? So what we did was build community. We are there. We actually care for the community. And you have to have a calling for this. It's not for everyone. Now, I know for me, I was called to serve others for God's glory, and that's my calling in on my life. And at the same time, I'm applying that in my work. And I care about people achieving their dreams because my parents sacrificed so much so that I could achieve mine. And I want others to see that success as well. So building that trust, it takes time. The other thing is showing up. And all, obviously, if there's birthday parties, there's events, things like that, you gotta be there. You gotta be their friend, but it has to be meaningful. Like I said earlier, if it's not meaningful, they're gonna see right through you, and you're not gonna have any time of day. So thankfully, Libre has been around for 10 years, and we have stuck around. The day after Election Day, we are still here, and we're still doing our grassroots work, phone banking, canvassing, text messages, and much more aside from that.
And I want to come back to that, because where you and I spend quite a bit of time each year working together is on some shared policy goals that Libre and the Texas Public Policy Foundation work on. And we want to highlight those for folks who are interested in what's going on in the Texas legislative session. But the pivot I want to make just momentarily is to some federal issues that I'll ask you, Monica, to comment on. And in particular, what I'm thinking about, hearing George talk about just the day-to-day activity of doing grassroots work, which is being part of a community, is the rationale of why our foundation opened an office in DC a few years ago. And one of the first policy areas that we sort of planted our flag with in the nation's capital on behalf of all Texans was immigration reform. And people in the swamp, going back to your comment, Monica, about just being simple people in the swamp are not. They're very complicated, and so complicated they couldn't figure out the following: that the vast majority of Texans, whether we're Anglos like me, folks of Mexican descent as the two of you are, we are all pro-immigrant. And we're pro-immigrant because in the civil society known as Texas, every day we live out the American dream more profoundly than anyone on the planet. One of the reasons for that is we can actually celebrate our diversity in the best sense of that word, whether it be our skin color, our native language, our religion, and we can do so with smiles on our faces because we understand that while the left might want to use those differences to divide us, they're very unifying for us as Texans. And so we ought to go to the nation's capital and talk about immigration reform in a way that tells people this ought not be a policy that divides folks on the right. Folks on the right ought to be taking the lead. And so I'm curious, Monica, in your experience or as you look ahead to the next few years, what are some of those key issues in the Rio Grande Valley that you think will attract a majority of voters as they're taking stock of America in 2021?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about our district and what is so unique about it. This district goes all the way down to Hidalgo. We are in the McAllen-Edinburgh area, which houses the largest Border Patrol sector in the nation. Now, what most people don't realize is that Border Patrol agents are friends, there are neighbors, there are relatives. These are people that are trusted and respected in our community. In 2019, we had close to 500,000 illegal aliens cross our borders just through CD15. So our communities, our American communities on this side, really saw the stress of the amount of people that this put not only on our communities, but on our law enforcement officers and our Border Patrol and custom agents. What they don't realize, and the rest of the nation, is that we have a border wall called the border levee just south of us and just north of us, where they did not have that kind of penetration into our country. Now, why is this important? It's important because our American communities need to be kept safe, as well as the citizens and law enforcement officers who are out there sacrificing their lives every single day. But I come from an immigrant family, just as you all do. And as I said, my grandfather wanted me to have equal opportunity, not equal results. And when we have our immigrants coming through the back door, then they do not have that opportunity for the American dream. And in fact, when they're coming through the back door illegal, they're taken advantage of from the coyotes, from the drug cartel. There is a child sex trafficking that come across, and we cannot monitor who is coming through our borders. And unfortunately, what the mainstream media doesn't tell us is that, yes, there may be some innocent stories that come through the back door, but they don't, and they fail to tell us about the people who come in with malintentions to our American community. And these people are going all over our nation, and we have no way to track them, and we have no way of knowing exactly the harm that they could do to our communities and to our citizens. And so the people in this area, and that was one of the reasons why it really resonated in 2020, our campaign, is the people of this area understand, because they have lived through it. They see the devastation this causes, not only for the immigrants, but for American communities.
And so, Monica, whether it's the immigration issue or other issues that the nation's capital, Congress, needs to grapple with, there are some real opportunities there for people on the ground, voters, grassroots folks, to exert pressure on their representatives to make some common sense reforms. And it's that kind of work that we know George does every day with Libre. And George, rather than talk about DC for the next couple of minutes, I want to take stock with you, or have you take stock of what's going on in the Texas legislative session. Each session, you and our organization develop some priorities that we believe will enhance the quality of life for Texans. What's that list? Number one, that list of policies that y'all are working on that you've identified as priorities. And then number two, why do you think those are important, even beyond the nuts and bolts of the policy? Why are those important for messaging, for broadening the audience?
Thanks, Kevin. I'm actually going to start with that second question. Why is it important? The list of the four or so policies that we've looked into, the reason why it's important, it's because it helps improve everyone's lives, all Texans, and that's important. And what we found meeting with our legislators, Democrats and Republicans, is that they all want to improve quality of care and make it affordable. They want to have a conservative Texas budget. They want to see pretrial bail reform, where individuals who are low risk, low-level first-time offenders who are not a risk to society, so that they can get back out into the community, work, and provide for their families. They want to see that. And then obviously education opportunity. Those are the four areas that we're focusing on. And education opportunity, like I said, we've met with Democrats and Republicans. And what we've seen, at least in the Valley, is that we want to have the opportunity to choose where our kids go to school. And I have an example for you. For me, my wife and I have a 4-year-old son, we decided to take him to a charter school idea, public schools here. That worked for us. And when they gave us the option to take him in person or keep him at home learning, we decided to keep him at home learning. That was great for us. My neighbor enrolled their son, same age as my son, at IDEA. That didn't work for them. And that was fine. Why? They went to the regular public school down the street, and that is working for them. That is what opportunity provides, education opportunity. So those are the 4 areas, and why it's important is because it's going to improve everyone's lives.
Yeah, I tell you that I think that there is such an opportunity in this year's Texas legislative session, and this is important even for viewers outside Texas, because the list of priorities that George mentioned, in addition to some things that we're working here at our foundation, election integrity, namely, will keep Texas Texan, as we like to say here at the foundation. And that becomes a model of policy reform and also how we communicate about our issues for the rest of the country. And so we always believe that all eyes are on Texas. I think that's especially true here in 2021. So one of the reasons that's true, to switch to a little more challenging subject before we talk about solutions to that challenging subject, is that we have a new presidential administration. Of course, we recognize President Biden is the president. We pray for him every day, not just for the reason that he occupies the office, but for him as a person. So no sour grape thinking here. But the reality is that folks who are left of center control the executive branch, they control the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And that is a real headwind. It's a challenge for those of us who are trying to create a more prosperous and a more free America. So I'm just curious, starting with you, Monica, what your assessment is of the policy landscape in Washington, D.C. right now. And for our viewers, what would you say are the top issues we need to be keeping track of as we navigate those policy challenges?
Yes, well, first, you're exactly right, is that we pray for our president because, as we said before, the success of our country is for all Americans, right? Unfortunately, our president currently has signed a record number of executive orders, more than any other president. He talks about unity, but unfortunately, his actions have not shown that. What concerns me is that he's bypassing Congress in order to make things happen that he feels that are partial to his party and that the country wants. And this is not the way our Constitution was built. That's not the way that things are supposed to work in Congress and with the president. So it is very alarming that some of the actions that he's done are bypassing Congress and following the way that our Constitution was meant to be built. Now, the things that I think that are very important are what we have talked about. Number one is the immigration and that border wall, because that not only affects my district, which is a CD 15, but that affects the entire nation. He rescinded one order. We went back to the Obama era catch and release program. That means we're catching illegal immigrants right here in CD 15, and we're releasing them all over the country. We don't know who these people are. We don't know the backgrounds, and we have no way to track them. That should disturb people on both sides of the aisle. So number one, protecting our borders and protecting our American communities. Number two, the second thing we should be talking about is our gun laws, our Second Amendment right. I tell people that the Second Amendment is so important for us to protect. It's there for a reason. And it is when our government becomes too big, Americans should be able to protect themselves. And so we have to keep that right and respect our Second Amendment. And the first thing that, I think we took for granted even 3 years ago is our First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. We've seen a lot of censorship over the last 3 months that are disturbing, so disturbing in some cases that we even had the Mexican government step up and say, there's a problem in the United States. That kind of censorship of a president or other individuals who have an opposing idea is not right. And we should all be concerned about it. That is why it is the First Amendment. So those are the three things that I feel are very important on a national level that we must tackle right away.
It's a target-rich environment, as we like to say, and I think for those of us who do policy work for a living, as you said, Monica, the attacks on the First Amendment are really troubling, and unfortunately, they involve not just freedom of speech, although for obvious reasons you highlighted that. Hopefully, here in Texas, again speaking about our legislative session, we'll see some action of defense in that regard. So, George, curious about your sense of the policy landscape in DC. We're a few weeks into the new administration. One party controls both chambers of the Capitol. I know you tend to focus more on Texas matters, but obviously that context in DC is something that's relevant to the work that you're doing here in Texas. What's your sense of the landscape, and what can our viewers do about it?
Yeah, well, one, we also have federal priorities right now with the legislative session in Texas. That's taking up a lot of our time, but there's a lot going on in DC. And one thing is what we already know is one party does not control what our policies look like. If that is immigration, if that is free speech, you got to take both sides to come together and find a solution. There's an example of this right now with HR 1. That is a free speech bill where they want the Democrats are looking at censoring people from being able to donate to organizations that they want to be able to donate to. And a lot of people, we talk about transparency, but we talk about transparency for government and privacy for the private citizen, right? So that is one. And the other thing, we talked about immigration, there's nothing that's happened in my lifetime with immigration, and that's unfortunate. 2 years ago, I took some dreamers to DC, a few of them from my church. And these are people who came here no fault of their own, who have lived here. The few that I took are business owners. And we met with Democrats and Republicans to show them, hey, these are people in your district, people who are creating jobs, who are productive members of society, not depending on government handouts. And right now we're optimistic that we'll find something there. But at the end of the day, we need Republicans and Democrats to come along together.
Yeah, and it seems like the kind of reform that would be, if not comprehensive, at least substantive enough on enough fronts, like continuing to secure the border and also finding some resolution to the Dreamers, to DACA, is ridiculously elusive in a place like DC that's just so broken right now. And it's that kind of thing that causes frustration among voters that I know both of you deal with every day. And so I'm going to ask each of you one more question, and then we'll turn to the audience questions, because audience members certainly have better questions than I do. And so, Monica, for you, one of the things that folks in say West Texas, known as a big oil and gas producing part of the state, very important to the world, may not appreciate is that issue of energy policy paired with good environmental policy is just as important in your district, because what we do in America on energy policy affects the daily lives of each of us. And this is something that I know you've spoken eloquently about, and just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak about it this afternoon.
Absolutely. The oil industry and oil field jobs are very important to the constituents of CD15. There are many people who work in this industry who are very concerned, as they should be. Right now, with the executive order that Biden put out, there was an immediate job loss of 11,000 jobs and up to 70,000 when you take in small businesses, restaurants, employees. Lots of job losses. Look, it is irresponsible to destroy jobs in the oil field industry when we do not have something already set up for these individuals to go to. It's just that simple. It's irresponsible. And not only that, but oil field jobs are high paying, good jobs. And so to find them that equal pay at the same time is very challenging. I will say this as well. What is happening on a national level, but even on a world level, when we look at China, and that's a whole other subject we can get into, is that we have taken away our energy independence by doing this as well. And so we have to think about the protection and security of our country when it comes to these oil field jobs. And that industry is very important, and people have already lost their jobs and businesses because of the recent executive orders.
I think that's well said. And a follow-up question for you, George, is that we also know from the research we do and a little bit of grassroots work that we do, that there's an additional angle to the excellent point that Monica makes about the impact of Green New Deal policies. You know, for example, last year we were opposing the city of San Antonio's efforts to begin implementing the so-called climate action plan, which basically is the Green New Deal packaged in a local way. The impact of that is that you see not just utility prices go up, your electric bill becomes more expensive, but you start seeing that in every sector of the economy. That's the kind of thing, this is the question for you, that I presume you hear when you're talking to folks at the grassroots level, which is that they're not dumb. They can make the connection between these really expensive policies in DC and their own light bill. I'm just curious if you might expand on that for us, because I think what y'all do so well is sort of look out on the sidewalk level, these somewhat complex policy areas.
Yeah, I was in Starr County, which is the county next over to Hidalgo County, just a few weeks ago, and I was talking to some friends and family out there, and I asked them, because the county voted, 1 out of every 2 voters voted for President Trump, and I asked them, what was it? And they said jobs. So they weren't voting on personality, they were voting on policies. They noticed that less regulation and cutting taxes provided the opportunity for them to get ahead in life and to put food on the table and to prosper and thrive. So a lot of them work in the oil fields, like Monica mentioned. So that was a big one. And down here, it's hot. When you use your energy, it's going to be expensive. And just anywhere else in the country, in the north where it's cold, you're using that heat right now. That costs a lot of money. And if you're cutting these jobs and putting these chokeholds on them, prices are going to go up, and that affects everyday Americans.
Yeah, and I that's excellent too. Thanks for that response. And I also encourage people, as we're dealing with the framing of issues from the left, the radical left, that we recognize that often it's good just to reject their framing. And so, they want us to step into this trap about the Green New Deal that turns us into people who are deniers of climate change. And I think it's important to recognize, the climate has changed, especially over the last 300 years. And man's probably had some effect over the last 100. We don't quite know the full extent of it. But what we do know, this is the point, is that if you spend that $15 trillion implementing the Green New Deal, that not only will you cost jobs and cost people their livelihoods and their quality of life, you will at most reduce global temperatures by 0.1 degrees. So you're not even going to have the effect that you purport to by spending all that money. So it may just be that the Green New Deal is about something other than climate change. And I'm really grateful that each of you, with the excellent point you make, give our audience some ammunition there. Well, look, I want to pivot to audience questions, which is always the highlight of this live stream. And I'll ask both of you the following question, but we'll start with you, Monica. And that is that observers of the 2020 election have called this a red wave, especially in places like where you are and where you ran for office, the Rio Grande Valley. This audience member is asking, however, why are we seeing this shift in South Texas and not as profoundly in areas like Dallas and Austin?
Well, I will tell you, it was an exciting year in 2020. And I believe that the Democrats have always just had a hold of South Texas and the border areas. And there were many candidates from Brownsville all the way to El Paso who, in some cases, it was the first time they had a Republican run ever. And so it was exciting to have great quality candidates out there doing the grassroots work that we have talked about, which is knocking on doors, educating people about how their values align with this party. And I think really when it came down to it, it was not about liking or disliking President Trump. It was liking the policies that they saw help them and their families, whether it was a pay increase or less regulation on their small businesses. So what they saw was policies that were helping Hispanics. In fact, what we saw was we had the lowest unemployment for Hispanics, lowest unemployment for Hispanics, highest Hispanic home ownership. And people were seeing that along the Rio Grande Valley. And I think that they had an awakening in 2020. And that is why we saw this dramatic shift go into the Republican Party.
It sure is fascinating and bears watching. I know there are some left of center groups who spend a lot of time and money on campaigns who are deeply concerned about that trend. Going back to a point I made earlier, which is not at all a political one, it's a social one about daily life in Texas. The three of us know, given our different backgrounds and living in different parts of the state, that Texans are just a happy lot. And we're a happy lot because in the differences that we may possess, we don't see divisions. We see opportunities to work together to build an even better culture together. We've been doing that for just a few hundred years in Texas. Imperfect, of course, because humans are. I think that's the kind of message beyond policy that transcends politics that this country deeply, deeply needs. So to wrap that up, would say that, yes, the Texas legislative session bears watching, but far more important than that, just how we go about our daily lives in Texas bears watching. You want more unity in this country? Look at how we do it in Texas. So, George, just a quick follow-up for you on this question about this trend. And that is why we aren't seeing that in places like Dallas and Austin. Have you unearthed something in conversations you're having with people that's particular to our big city areas?
The one thing I've noticed is those in the Valley, a lot of the jobs that they depend on are those oil field jobs, and a lot of even law enforcement jobs, Customs and Border Patrol jobs. So the conversations that were happening in the last election cycle were about law enforcement and energy. So what we found on the ground is that most of these individuals that live here have to actually go out for jobs out of the area. So they rely on the income from out of there to bring back here and spend at their local grocery stores, at the gas stations, at the malls. And whereas in the Dallas area, there's a lot of good paying jobs in Dallas. So a lot of people are staying there. So that could be it. Another part, I want to take some credit for it, is the work that Libre has been doing for the last 10 years here in the Valley, is educating and informing through our C3, the Libre Institute, and the Libre Initiative. So obviously, the policies from the election cycle have a lot to say, but I'd take a little bit of that credit too for the work we're doing.
I think you deserve it. In fact, I was going to give you that. It's clearly one of the factors there. So next question, which I'll pitch to you, Monica. How can we best communicate that the values Hispanics share regarding family and community are those embraced by the conservative and free market movement?
Well, I think the best way to do that is by us spending more time in the Rio Grande Valley and along the border. What we need to do is keep educated, take it to the next level with the Hispanic community. And as I said before, it's really as simple as saying, hey, your values are pro-God, pro-life, pro-Constitution. And guess what? The Republican Party's values are the same. And if we can touch enough people, especially in the Spanish language television and radio, part of the challenge that we face is that many of the communities along the border are still lower income. And so they're only watching the mainstream media, television. And so we have to go through those mediums to touch them still. So there's a lot of work to still be done. So I'm sure Jorge and myself, we both welcome people and more attention from the party on a state and on a national level, because what we can say and what I can say is that people here are awakened. And what happened in 2020 with the defund of the police, with taking away or wanting to restrict gun ownership, and the pro-life movement that was happening under President Trump, the people are concerned because they're hardworking individuals. They believe in our constitutional rights, and they come from many countries in South America where there is a socialism. They don't want to see that here. And so I think 2020 really made us show the stark differences between the Republicans and the Democrats. And that's why we saw an awakening in the Hispanic culture. We still have work to do, and we still need and want that grassroots in this area to keep educating for the 2022 election. And the time is now. We cannot wait until 2022 to start. We must start now.
That is correct. Members of the audience who are real interested in the campaign and election cycle, not the purview of Texas public policy, because we're focused on the ideas and policy side. Both of those are important. This timing is really crucial, as Monica says. And so, George, just want to come back to you on a related question that an audience member asked, and that is, what are the mechanics? What's the approach of how Libre goes about taking this message, say as Monica outlined it, and reaching these communities? How do you actually accomplish the work that you do, in other words?
Yeah, you got to break down the messaging. You can get deep down into the weeds of the policy, but that's going to go right over anyone's head that's not involved in policy 24/7. One, you got to break it down to a level that we're all going to understand, and that's me included, right? So, and making them or showing them that these policies have negative or positive consequences on their life, and you inform them of why they should take action and why it's important to take action. So how do we do it? Like I said in the very beginning of this conversation, you got to get to know individuals, take them out to eat. They're your friends, your neighbors, people in your church. Just you have to try, and it has to be meaningful.
That is so true. I hear time and again, every time I go down to the Rio Grande Valley in particular, where folks are so friendly, and ask them, what can conservative types do a better job of? It's exactly what you outlined. And they'd say repeatedly, and it makes sense. I mean, any of us as humans would say this: don't come once every 2 years or once every 4 years asking for our votes. It's so pandering and condescending. No one, regardless of our background, would like that. Be part of the community. And it's really common sense. And if we can do that, couched in sincere optimism, we start building a movement. And it goes back to the question y'all dealt with about why we're seeing a real shift toward explicit conservative voting in the counties of the Valley and even beyond, other parts of Texas, north and west of y'all, northwest of y'all, that I think will continue. So one more question for you, Monica, and then we'll begin to wrap up here. And this question from an audience member is, how can we get more Hispanics involved in running for office?
Well, I think it starts with getting a Hispanic elected. And what our area really needs is hope. When I ran in 2020, what I found was that even Republicans in this area didn't have the hope that anybody would have even a chance to get elected. And so what we proved in the 2020 election is that it is possible, and there is an awakening, and that Hispanics understand how their values are aligned with the Republican Party. So now there's hope, there's motivation, there's excitement. So we've got to take it to the next step. is we've got to get a Hispanic, I'd like it to be me, of course, elected in the 2022 election. Someone from the border that understands truly this border community. I'm born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley. I understand its needs. And I think that once that happens, I think that will really encourage other Hispanics to run for office. I'll tell you this, our Hidalgo County GOP just recently put on a candidate training, never been done before. In that training, we had 65 individuals show up. We've never had people show up and say, I am willing to step out into the community and say, I'm a Republican running for office. So that was extremely exciting. Since then, we've had 5 people actually sign the paperwork and said, I'm moving forward because, Monica, I saw you do it. You were a small business owner. You're still in business. You didn't go under, you didn't go under in your business, and you still have your employees and you're able to pay your bills. And you know what? We need a true two-party system here where people can have that choice and get to understand the differences. So we're very excited about that. And I think that was all because we doubled the Republican vote in Hidalgo. So I think there's a lot more Hispanic candidates coming this way. The next step is just to get one of us elected to a federal position. And I hope that's me in 2022.
So thank you, Monica, for that response. I think it's something that your encouragement is relevant to anyone. And I would even take the liberty, if you don't mind, of making it nonpartisan, which TPPF is, that we need people to be engaged. And that's what we say at every event we do, especially in person here in our building. We're going to have differences of opinion, especially when we start thinking about folks being members of one political party or another. But the most important thing is that there's no way we can fix whatever the problems we believe exist in America without people stepping up and making the sacrifice in time and talent and treasure for this cause that's greater than ourselves, what we know is the United States of America. George, a quick follow-up from this audience member question, and that is, would you make a pitch for people to, and nothing against Monica's excellent point about federal office, but would you make a pitch in addition to people considering local office?
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, we need individuals who are going to espouse freedom-minded solutions. So if you are Hispanic or any other race, as long as you're espousing these freedom-minded solutions, you should run. And if you believe these at the local level, as they say, all politics is local, you can actually reach to your city councilman and your mayor. It's harder to start reaching your congressmen and your senators, but these are where you can have more impact. So that's what I would definitely do.
Yeah, thank you. There's one last question from the audience that's come in that I will take and be brief about it, because y'all are the stars here. And it sounds like it's a question about a TPPF priority, which is election integrity. And the person asks about Governor Abbott making this an emergency item in his state of the state, which means for folks outside Texas, the legislature has to deal with this issue. We've been talking about this for over a year because we hired some private investigators who proved for us that the nefarious practice of ballot harvesting is going on all over this state, not just in the Rio Grande Valley, but in our big cities and in some small cities. So we've got a four-pronged approach. We want to enforce against ballot harvesting. We need more people doing this at the local level and in the state attorney general's office. The second thing is we've forwarded a series of 3 bills to the legislature that we're not just advocating for, but we've made huge priorities. The Secretary of State in Texas needs greater authority over double checking the integrity of the voter rolls, even over the objection of some local county officials. Secondly, we have to make the entire process of mail-in balloting much more transparent. It's a very popular thing in Texas and everywhere to be able to mail in ballots. But what's happening is that we're allowing those ballots to come in with no signature verification. So in other words, Daffy Duck may be the person who submitted your mail-in ballot. We have to stop that. And the fourth thing is we need to make sure that there is a system of very clear review of election results. And so we can look to, say, Florida, which was a debacle in 2000. And in 2020, they had their results reported by midnight. That's the kind of example that we, all of us in Texas and beyond, need to be expecting. So we'll talk about election integrity and election reform on another live stream, but I wanted to be sure and be responsive to that audience member. So with all of that said, George and Monica, you know the final question I like to ask guests. This has been a very challenging 15 months for Americans, and yet the two of you are very optimistic about the future. And so, George, to turn to you first, what is it that makes you optimistic about America's future?
Because the American spirit is alive, and I believe in the face of adversity, Americans have always come up stronger on the other side. And new ideas are coming up, and new ideas and opportunities will come out. And I believe that market forces will respond to that quite generously.
Excellent. Thank you. Monica, how about you?
Well, I believe in the American future because I believe in humanity. And although the media will tend to show that we are divided, I believe that Americans are united and that we all want to see a better America and that the American dream is still alive. And when we look at the everyday person on the street, from a little league soccer coach to a hospital worker, we see that American spirit alive and well. And so I think that we have to look at the things that bring us together and not that tear us apart. So I am happy and optimistic about the future and looking forward to a great year.
Well, Monica de la Cruz Hernandez, George Martinez, thank you all so much for joining us today. Of course, we'll have you back as the year unfolds. There will be much to talk about, as in spite of everything the legacy leftist media tells us, the conservative movement is alive and well, not just in Texas generally, but where the two of you live in the Rio Grande Valley, what they would argue is the least likely of places to accept our shared message. So thanks for highlighting that for our audience members. May the Lord continue to prosper the work of your hands. For those of you in the audience, the same to you. May the Lord bless you. May he continue to bless this country. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.